He walked out on Judge Frank Caprio, but when his lawyer dragged him back, what happened next didn't just save him from jail, it saved his soul. This is the story of how arrogance met justice and learned humility in the hardest way. It was a Friday afternoon. One of those long, quiet afternoons in Providence when the courtroom feels almost tired after a week filled with stories, faces, and lessons. I was nearing the end of the day, reviewing the docket for what I thought would be a simple case, a reckless driving charge. I remember thinking, one more, and then we'll call it a week. Little did I know that the man walking through those doors would test every ounce of patience, principle, and faith I'd built over nearly 5 decades on the bench. The bailiff called the next name, Danny Morrison. Through the courtroom doors came a man dressed like he was walking into a business meeting, not a courtroom. An expensive suit, gold watch, polished shoes that seemed to announce themselves with every step. I've seen many defendants over the years, people from every walk of life. Some walk in nervous, others defiant, but very few walk in entitled. Danny Morrison did. He was 47 years old, a successful car dealer with 3 dealerships across the city, self-made from what I later learned. Started with a small used car lot and turned it into an empire. A story that, under different circumstances, I might have admired. But what stood before me that afternoon wasn't a story of hard work. It was a man consumed by his own reflection. He didn't address the court with a greeting or a hint of respect. Instead, he leaned on the podium, looked at me like I was a clerk behind a counter, and said, "Yeah, I'm here about the driving thing. Look, Judge, I'm a busy man. I employ 47 people, pay more taxes than most folks make in a year. Can we just settle this with a fine so I can get back to running my businesses? Now, in my courtroom, I don't demand people bow or grovel, but I do expect one thing: respect. Not for me personally, but for the institution, for the principle of law that keeps society from descending into chaos. Respect levels the field. It's what makes the janitor, the CEO, and the judge equals under the eyes of justice." I looked up from the papers, noting his tone, his posture, the impatience in his eyes. There was no remorse, just irritation, like the law was an inconvenience interrupting his schedule. "And Mr. Morrison," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you failed to appear for your original court date. Today we're addressing both that and your reckless driving charge. Do you understand the seriousness of this matter?" He smirked. "Come on, Judge. You know how the world works. People like me keep the economy running. We create jobs, pay taxes. A little flexibility goes a long way." There was a ripple of silence. Even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to buy respect with their resume, but there was something about the ease with which he dismissed the law that struck me. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't unaware. He was comfortable in his arrogance. I took off my glasses, an old habit of mine when something important needed to be said. "Now, Mr. Morrison," I said evenly, "you seem to believe that your financial success exempts you from basic courtesy in my courtroom." That's when he laughed. Actually laughed, a sound that echoed across the room like a challenge. "Respect? Look, I've been paying people salaries in this city for 15 years. Half the cops who wrote that ticket probably bought their cars from me. And you want to lecture me about respect?" I watched the expressions change around the room, quiet shock, disbelief, even a bit of fear. An elderly woman in the gallery gasped softly. Officer Martinez, the man who'd written the ticket, shook his head. My bailiff took a subtle step forward, sensing the shift in tone. "Yes, sir," I said, standing slowly. "Her wealth does not grant you immunity from courtesy. Your tax contributions do not purchase special treatment in this courtroom. And employing people does not excuse your failure to understand that in here, we are all equal under the law." His face flushed, his ego wounded. You could see the battle play across his eyes. A man unaccustomed to being corrected, especially in public. "Equal under the law?" He scoffed. It's rich, Judge. You and I both know this system doesn't treat everyone equally. You're going to waste my time over a parking ticket while real criminals are out there walking free. I don't have time for this lecture from someone who's never had to meet a payroll." For a moment, I said nothing. The insult lingered hanging in still air like I could feel the tension in the room. Not anger, but deep disappointment. After decades of serving this community, that line hit harder than I expected. I had worked my way through law school. I had stood in construction boots before I ever wore a robe. To have a man who knew nothing of my path dismiss it as meaningless. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was revealing. So I gave him one last chance. Mr. Morrison, I said quietly, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your approach and show this court the respect it deserves. He sighed loudly, checked his gold watch, and muttered, You know what? I'm done with this. I've got real problems. And then he did what I never thought I'd witness in my courtroom. He turned his back, waved his hand like I was a waiter he was dismissing, and said, Add it to my tab, Your Honor. The sarcasm in those last two words burned through the silence. He walked out. Just like that. For a few moments, nobody moved. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I stood there, letting the silence speak before I finally said, Court will be in recess. Mr. Morrison's case will be rescheduled and additional charges will be filed. As the courtroom slowly emptied, I sat there longer than usual. After all these years, after thousands of cases, you'd think you'd seen everything. But arrogance, real, unfiltered arrogance, still has a way of shaking you. That afternoon, I thought about how easily success blinds people. How quickly some forget that respect isn't a favor. It's the foundation of every civilized act we should. And as I gathered my notes, one thought stayed with me. Justice doesn't just reveal who's right. It reveals who we are when we think no one can hold us accountable. Danny Morrison had just learned that the hard way. But his lesson wasn't over yet. The following Monday morning, I arrived at court a little earlier than usual. The air was heavy, almost reflective. The kind of morning where you can feel the city waking up slowly. I remember sitting at my bench, going through the docket, still thinking about Danny Morrison, the man who had walked out of my courtroom as if it were beneath him. Cases come and go, but some linger like unfinished conversations. It wasn't about pride. I've been insulted before, sometimes by anger, sometimes by ignorance. But what Morrison did went deeper. He disrespected the very foundation of justice, the principle that no one is above the law. That truth, the one I've devoted my life to upholding, had been mocked in front of a courtroom full of people. Around 8:30, as I was reviewing case files, my clerk came in and said, Judge, you have a call on line 2. It's from someone claiming to be Daniel Morrison's attorney. I picked up the phone, expecting an apology, maybe a request for leniency, something to smooth over what happened. Instead, a crisp, calculated voice greeted me. Judge Caprio, this attorney Harold Benton. I'm representing Mr. Daniel Morrison in regard to the incident last Friday. My client regrets how things unfolded, but he maintains that his conduct was provoked by what he perceives as an unfair and disrespectful treatment by the court. I could almost hear the smirk behind those words. Feel provoked, he said. Not remorseful. Provoked. Benton, your client walked out of a live courtroom while under active proceedings. That is not only a sign of disrespect, but also contempt of court. There was a pause. The kind of silence that tells you the other person is choosing their next words carefully. Then he said, Judge, I'm sure we can resolve this without escalating it further. Mr. Morrison is a pillar of this community. He contributes to numerous charities, sponsors youth programs, and employs dozens of local families. He simply felt unfairly targeted. I interrupted. Benton, you seem to be under the impression that charity work and employment numbers can substitute for accountability. They cannot. He cleared his throat. With all due respect, Judge, I don't think this needs to become a spectacle. My client's reputation is significant, and negative publicity wouldn't serve anyone well. Perhaps we can reach an understanding. A private apology, a donation maybe, and there it was, the offer, the quiet suggestion that money, once again, could smooth out what respect could not. I leaned back in my chair, holding the receiver just far enough to take a breath. I'd had similar calls before, people trying to trade influence for integrity, but hearing it again reminded me just how fragile respect for justice can be in certain circles. Benton, I said finally, I tell your client that this isn't about publicity. It's about principle. And as long as I sit on this bench, those principles are not for sale. There was a long silence. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "Understood, Judge. I'll inform my client." I hung up the phone and sat there staring at the polished wood of my desk. The city outside was alive, cars honking, people hurrying to work, but inside, the air felt still, heavy with reflection. You see, moments like that test you in ways that verdicts never can. Every judge faces them. The quiet temptations, the subtle pressures, the polite offers that seem harmless on the surface, but erode the core of justice 1 inch at a time. Later that afternoon, I received another call. This one wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the mayor's office. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar. Frank, I heard about what happened with Danny Morrison. He's a big supporter of the city's youth initiatives. He just made a large donation to the scholarship fund last month. Maybe it'd be best to let this one fade quiet. Now, I have immense respect for our public officials, but when influence tries to steer the course of justice, even subtly, that's when the alarm bells start ringing. "Am I here?" I said. "You know I have great respect for your office, but this courtroom doesn't operate on donations or favors. It runs on fairness, and fairness can't be negotiated over the phone." The line went silent for a moment. Then the mayor sighed. "I understand, Frank. I just wanted to make sure this doesn't blow up into something bigger than it needs to be." "Well," I replied, "sometimes justice needs to be bigger, especially when the small moments show us how fragile it can be." When I hung up, I realized something. This wasn't just about a man who walked out of court. It was about what that act represented. It was a test. Not of the law, but of its guardians. Would we bend to influence, or would we stand firm even when standing meant standing alone? 2 days later, a new notice was sent to Mr. Morrison's attorney. The defendant ordered to appear before the court for contempt hearing. That Friday, the courtroom was packed. News of the incident had begun to spread quietly through the legal community. There's something magnetic about arrogance meeting accountability. People come to see whether justice will hold its ground. As I waited for the session to begin, I glanced toward the doors, wondering if Danny Morrison would show up. And if he did, which version of him would walk through? The defiant businessman or the humble citizen? Because in my courtroom, justice doesn't play favorites. And no matter how high you climb, you never stand taller than the law. The following Friday morning, I sat in my courtroom earlier than usual. The air was different, heavier, quieter, almost waiting. The benches were already half filled by the time the clock struck 9. Court clerks whispered among themselves. The bailiff adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, and I could feel the weight of expectation hovering in the room. Everyone knew this was the morning Danny Morrison was due back. It's a strange thing when a courtroom that has seen years of anger, fear, and sorrow suddenly waits not for a verdict, but for a man's return. At precisely 9:10, then the back doors opened. Morrison walked in. Not with the swagger he'd shown the last time, not with that air of superiority that had once filled the room. This time he looked smaller. His usual expensive suit hung loose on his frame. His shoulders were tense, his steps measured. And behind him walked his lawyer, Harold Benton, his face stern but uneasy. I remember watching him approach the defendant's table. Every step seemed to take an eternity. He didn't look around, didn't glance at the audience. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. When I finally called the session to order, you could have heard a pin drop. Mr. Morrison," I began, my voice echoing softly through the room. "The last time you stood before this court, you walked out without permission. An act that constitutes contempt of court. You understand the seriousness of this offense?" He nodded slightly, his voice faint. "Yes, Your Honor." Do you understand," I continued, "that no one, not wealth, not influence, not reputation, is above the authority of this court?" This time he lifted his eyes, and for a brief moment I saw it. Not arrogance, not defiance, but shame. Real, human shame. The kind that humbles even the proudest hearts. "Yes, Your Honor," he said again. Louder this time, though his voice trembled slightly. "I understand." I leaned back in my chair, studying him for a long moment. His lawyer cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Honor," Benton began, "my client wishes to express his sincere remorse for his conduct last week. He recognizes that his behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful. Mr. Morrison has come here today to personally apologize to this court and to Your Honor." I nodded slowly. Then let's hear it." Danny took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to face me directly. "Judge Caprio," he began, his voice cracking just a little. "And when I walked out of your courtroom, I wasn't thinking about the law. I wasn't thinking about respect. I was thinking about myself. I thought my money made me untouchable, that I could do whatever I wanted and walk away from the consequences. But I was wrong." He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes darting between me and the rows of silent spectators. "I've had a week to think about what I did," he continued, his tone quieter now, more deliberate. And that week was the longest one of my life. I realized how easily I dismissed something sacred, the court, the system that protects all of us. I disrespected not just you, Judge, but every person who believes in fairness and justice. There was something in his tone that caught me off guard. Sincerity. It wasn't the polished performance of a businessman used to getting his way. It was a man, stripped of all his armor, standing naked before truth. I folded my hands on the bench. "Mr. Morrison," I said gently, "it takes a certain kind of strength to admit when you're wrong. But tell me, what changed your mind?" He hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Honestly, Judge, it was my lawyer and my wife. They both told me the same thing. And I didn't just embarrass myself, I embarrassed my family. My kids saw the video online. My daughter, she's 16, asked me if I really thought I was better than other people." His voice broke then. He looked down, his hand covering his mouth as if the words themselves burned to say aloud. "That question," he said finally, "was harder than any fine or sentence you could give me." The courtroom was silent, not the cold, procedural kind of silence, but the heavy human kind that follows truth when it lands squarely in the room. I took a moment before speaking. Morrison," I said slowly, "there's a lesson in what you just said. The law doesn't exist to humiliate. It exists to remind us that power means nothing without respect, and that respect means everything without power." He nodded quietly, tears welling in his eyes. I don't want to see anyone punished just to prove a point," I continued, "but I do believe every mistake has a lesson. You faced your own today, not from me, but from your conscience and from your family." Then I looked around the room, at the faces watching, at the clerk, the officers, even the lawyer who seemed slightly more human than he had when this began. "This courtroom," I said softly, "isn't a place for pride. It's a place for understanding. And Mr. Morrison, you've taken your first step toward that understanding today." When I adjourned the session, Morrison turned to his lawyer and quietly said, "Thank you." Then he looked up at me. Not as a businessman, not as a man trying to protect his reputation, but as a person who finally understood the value of humility. And as he walked out, this time with permission, I couldn't help but think, sometimes the loudest lessons are learned in silence. Because justice isn't always about the gavel striking down. Sometimes it's about the human heart standing up. When I came into court that following Monday morning, the air felt lighter than it had in days. The storm had passed, not just for the courtroom, but I suspected for Danny Morrison himself. His case had drawn attention, local papers, social media posts, even radio chatter. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some said he got what he deserved. Others said I'd been too harsh. But I wasn't thinking about headlines that morning. I was thinking about purpose. Justice without purpose is punishment. Justice with purpose is transformation. When Danny stood before me again, he looked like a different man entirely. His expensive watch was gone. His suit was simpler, his hair unstyled, his voice steady but humble. He didn't bring his lawyer this time. He didn't bring excuses. "Well, Mr. Morrison," I began, "last week you showed the court something that money couldn't buy, humility. Today, we decide what happens next." He nodded, his eyes clear but uncertain. "Yes, Your Honor." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what have you done since our last session?" He exhaled slowly. "I met with my company board. I told them what happened here. They didn't sugarcoat it. Said I embarrassed myself, the company, and the people who work for me. I also met with my kid's school counselor to apologize. I didn't want them hearing about their father's behavior from someone else. That, I must admit, took me by surprise. Apologies in my courtroom are not rare, but follow through outside of it. That's where you see true change." For a moment, I didn't speak. There was nothing more powerful than the redemption seen through a child's eyes. Morrison, I said finally, I believe you've started to understand something that too many people never do. That respect can't be demanded, it must be earned. However, this court still has a duty to ensure that your lesson is not forgotten. He nodded again, calm this time, almost relieved. I understand, Your Honor. Whatever you decide, I'll accept it. I looked down at my notes, then back up at him. You've already paid your fine, and I see no purpose in adding more financial penalties. Instead, I'm sentencing you to something I believe will serve both you and the community. He straightened curious. You will perform 50 hours of community service, specifically at a youth driving awareness program. You'll speak to young drivers about responsibility, safety, and the consequences of reckless decisions. You'll share your story, Mr. Morrison, not as a warning about punishment, but as an example of how pride can lead good people astray. He blinked, clearly surprised. You want me to talk to them? Yes, I said firmly. You've been given a platform all your life. You've used it to lead, to build wealth. Now use it to build character. Not just yours, but others. Teach them what arrogance costs and what humility gives back. The courtroom was still as I continued. This sentence isn't about humiliation, Mr. Morrison. It's about reflection. You're not being punished. You're being trusted. Trusted to turn your mistake into a message. He swallowed hard. I'll do it, Your Honor. I'll do it sincerely. I believe you will, I replied. Because change doesn't happen when a judge orders it. It happens when a man chooses it. He nodded, emotion visible in his face. Thank you, Judge. I don't deserve this leniency. This isn't leniency, I corrected him. It's accountability with purpose. There's a difference. At that moment, I could see that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The man who once strutted into my courtroom, dripping with arrogance and ego, was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the mirror doesn't lie, and humility doesn't break you. It rebuilds you. As the clerk noted his service terms, I watched him one last time. He stood taller, not with pride, but with gratitude. When what hearing concluded, he approached the bench. Your Honor, he said quietly, and may I say one more thing? Go ahead. He looked around the room, then back at me. When I walked out on you that first day, I thought I was proving my power. But walking back in, facing you, and owning what I did, that's when I realized what real strength looks like. It's not in money, it's in respect. Thank you for teaching me that. I gave a small nod. Mr. Morrison, I didn't teach you that. My wife did. I just gave it a voice. He smiled faintly, then extended his hand to the bailiff, thanking him before leaving the courtroom. That gesture, simple, genuine, told me more than any statement ever could. When the doors closed behind him, I sat in silence for a moment, reflecting. This job isn't about punishing people for breaking the law. It's about helping them understand the law. Because understanding leads to respect, and respect leads to change. Danny Morrison's case wasn't the most serious one I'd ever handled, but it became one of the most meaningful. It reminded everyone watching that redemption doesn't come from avoiding consequences. It comes from accepting them and turning them into something good. Before I adjourned court that day, I said something to the room, not for the record, but for the hearts that were listening. Every one of us makes mistakes. The question isn't whether we fall, it's whether we choose to rise differently. Justice isn't about the fine you pay, it's about the lesson you carry forward. Let this be a reminder that the greatest sentence is not one of punishment, but of purpose. And with that, I struck the gavel on, not as an end, but as a beginning. It was 6 months later when I saw Danny Morrison again. The seasons had changed. Summer's brightness had mellowed into the crispness of autumn, and so too had Danny. When he walked into my courtroom that morning, there was no trace of the man who had once strutted through those same doors with arrogance and disdain. Gone were the gold watch, the designer suit, the impatient sighs. He wore a modest jacket and carried a folder, not as a prop, but as a record of his journey. The bailiff announced, Case of the City of Providence versus Daniel Morrison, all up on community service compliance. Tim nodded. Moving forward. Danny approached the bench with quiet confidence. Not the confidence of wealth, but of someone who has done the hard work of change. When he spoke, his tone carried a calm sincerity. Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Morrison, I replied. It's been some time. How have you been spending it? He smiled faintly. Learning, Your Honor. A lot more than I expected to. That caught my attention. Tell me about that. He placed his folder gently on the table and began. I completed every hour of my community service. I spoke to students, to young drivers, to people who reminded me of myself 20 years ago. Full of ambition, but empty of patience. The first time I spoke, they looked at me like I was just another businessman giving a lecture. But when I told them about what happened here, about the day I walked out of your courtroom, they listened. He paused, taking a deep breath. At first, I was embarrassed to tell the story. But then I realized something. My mistake wasn't just about disrespecting this court. It was about disrespecting the values that built everything I thought I stood for. The more I spoke, the more I understood that humility isn't a weakness, and it's a strength most people never learn until life forces it upon them. The courtroom was silent. Even the clerk stopped typing. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the bench. And what did those young people teach you, Mr. Morrison? He smiled softer this time. That respect isn't a transaction. It's a reflection. When you give it, you get it back. Those students didn't care about what kind of car I drove or how many people I employed. They cared about honesty. They cared that someone who had failed was willing to admit it and make it right. He opened the folder, revealing letters, handwritten notes, dozens of them. These, he said, are from the students. They wrote about how my story made them think differently. Not just about driving, but about responsibility. One of them even told me she convinced her father to slow down behind the wheel because even rich men can make mistakes. I couldn't help but smile at that. Seems you've done more good than most realize. I don't know about that, Danny replied. What I'm proud of is that I've started a program at my dealerships called Drive with Dignity. We fund defensive driving classes for teenagers and sponsor community service events every month. I tell my staff, we're not just selling cars anymore. We're building responsibility on four wheels. There was quiet pride in his voice, but it wasn't boastful. It was the kind of pride that comes after humility, the kind that has been earned. I took a moment before speaking. Mr. Morrison, when you first appeared before me, your reputation was built on money and success. But both of those are fragile things. One bad decision, one moment of arrogance can destroy what took years to build. What you've done over the past 6 months, however, has rebuilt something far more valuable. Your character. He nodded slowly. Your Honor, when I left your courtroom that first day, I thought I'd ruined my name. But now I realize I didn't lose my reputation. I rediscovered it. I used to think being respected meant being feared. Now I know it means being trusted. That line stayed with me. Being trusted. In my years on the bench, I've seen people try to buy their way out of consequences, charm their way through penalties, or hide behind excuses. But genuine accountability, the kind that transforms reputation into redemption, is rare. And it's always visible in the eyes. I saw it that day in Danny Morrison's. But Mr. Morrison, I said, standing from the bench, if defendants ever do, you turned your sentence into a service, your mistake into a mission, and your punishment into purpose. For that, this court commends you. He looked stunned. Thank you, Your Honor. I don't know what to say. To say nothing, I replied, smiling. Just keep doing the work. The world doesn't need more apologies. It needs more examples. The courtroom was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. The kind filled with respect, not tension. I finalized the paperwork. Mr. Morrison, your contempt charges are officially dismissed. Your record will reflect successful completion of community service and full rehabilitation. You are, once again, a man of standing. At this time, standing on character, not ego. Danny exhaled, the weight of months lifting off his shoulders. Your Honor, I'll never forget this. You didn't just judge me, you taught me. I shook my head gently. No, Mr. Morrison, the lesson was always yours to learn. You just needed the courage to face it. As he turned to leave, he stopped near the door and looked back. Your Honor, would it be all right if I came back someday, not as a defendant, but as a speaker, to tell others that respect isn't given in a courtroom? It's lived outside it? That brought a rare warmth to my chest. You'll always have a place here, Mr. Morrison. The courtroom remembers those who learn from their mistakes, not those who run from them. He smiled, nodded, and walked out. This time, not as a man escaping justice, but as one carrying it within him. As the door closed, I looked down at the docket and up again at the quiet room. Justice had done its job, not through punishment. Because at the end of every case, every fine, every gavel strike, what matters most isn't the sentence. It's the change. And for Danny Morrison, the man who once stormed out of my courtroom, that change became his redemption.